Millbrook was a town ruled by fear and corruption. Small businesses were forced to pay for protection, and those who resisted faced threats, vandalism, or worse. But when Jacob Henderson, a Vietnam veteran and proud business owner, refused to kneel, he found himself arrested on false charges. What the corrupt officers didn't realize was that Jacob's son, Colonel Ethan Henderson, was about to bring a storm they would never forget. Millbrook was a town where fear ruled the streets, and power was held by those willing to exploit it. Corruption had long taken root, creeping into every institution like a slow-growing disease. The police force, meant to protect and serve, had become a private enforcement arm for the highest bidders, shaking down businesses under the guise of community safety. Local businesses, especially those owned by minorities or independent entrepreneurs, found themselves under constant pressure. Protection fees were not an option, they were a requirement. Refusing to pay meant harassment, vandalism, or worse. Broken windows, sudden random inspections that led to fines, and even unexplained fires had become the cost of defiance. Jacob Henderson, a Vietnam veteran and owner of Henderson's Auto Repair, had lived through wars, had stared death in the face, and had returned home with nothing but the hope of living a simple, honest life. But honesty in Millbrook came at a price. Jacob had built his shop from the ground up. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in the hum of engines and the familiar scent of motor oil. Over the years, he had become a respected figure in town, known for his integrity and skill. But in a town like Millbrook, being an honest man was dangerous. One afternoon, as Jacob was tightening the bolts on an engine mount, the bell above his shop door chimed. He wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and turned to see 3 police officers entering, their presence alone enough to make the air in the room feel heavier. Leading them was Officer Ryan Calloway, a tall, broad-shouldered man with cold, calculating eyes. "Afternoon, Mr. Henderson," Calloway said, running a hand along the hood of a freshly repaired vehicle. "Nice operation you've got here. Been here, what, 30 years?" 40, Jacob corrected, his voice steady. He knew what was coming. He had seen it happen to other business owners. Calloway let out a low whistle. "That's a long time. Must be tough keeping up with all the new regulations, safety inspections, insurance costs. It'd be a shame if something happened, like an unfortunate fire or a robbery. You ever think about extra security?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "I've got locks and a security camera. That's all I need." The officer smirked. "See, that's the thing. Some of us in the department, we're offering a little extra protection for businesses like yours. Make sure nothing bad happens, if you catch my drift. $500 a month, a small price to keep things running smooth." Jacob's grip on his rag tightened. "I'm not paying for protection I don't need." The room seemed to darken. Calloway's fake smile disappeared. "Think it over, old man," he said, stepping closer, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. "You don't want to be the only one in town without friends in the right places." With that, the officers turned and walked out, leaving Jacob staring at the floor, his fists clenched. He had fought in wars, had faced enemies far deadlier than these men. But he also knew that these kinds of battles weren't fought with fists. They were fought with resilience, strategy, and an unbreakable will. That night, Jacob sat in his small kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee, staring out the window at his quiet street. He thought of all the other businesses in town that had folded under pressure, their owners either scared into submission or run out of town. He thought of the young kids who grew up believing the police were the enemy, who had seen their fathers humiliated and their mothers crying over bills that never stopped piling up. He thought of his son, Ethan, thousands of miles away, fighting battles in foreign lands, battles where the enemy at least had the decency to fight in the open. What would Ethan say if he knew his own father was under siege in his hometown? The next morning, Jacob arrived at his shop to find the front window shattered, shards of glass reflecting the morning sun like tiny knives. Spray painted across his garage door were the words, "Pay up or pay the price." Inside, the destruction was even worse. His tools, some of which he had owned for decades, were scattered, broken, or stolen. Oil had been dumped over the floors, coating everything in a slick, black film of ruin. On his workbench, a dead rat lay sprawled, a knife pinning a note to its lifeless body. "Next time, it's you." Jacob stood in the wreckage, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. He could feel the anger curling inside him like smoke, hot and suffocating. But anger wouldn't fix this. Action would. He picked up the phone and dialed the police station, not expecting them to help, but knowing that every battle started with a move, a paper trail, a refusal to go quietly. What he didn't expect was to find Officer Calloway waiting for him at the station, standing behind the front desk like he owned the place. Well, Calloway drawled. Didn't take long, did it? Here to reconsider our offer. Jacob met his gaze without flinching. I'm here to file a report. My business was vandalized last night. Calloway chuckled, shaking his head. Vandalized, huh? Well, sometimes these things happen. Maybe some kids having a little fun. You know what would prevent this from happening again? Our protection plan. Jacob clenched his teeth. I want to speak to your superior. Calloway's smile didn't fade, but something in his eyes grew darker. You're disturbing the peace, Mr. Henderson. Making unfounded accusations against law enforcement. That could be considered resisting an officer's lawful commands. Before Jacob could react, Calloway had grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back and snapping on handcuffs. The other officers in the station barely looked up. It was just another day in Millbrook. As he was led to a holding cell, Jacob remained silent. He knew this wasn't over. He knew men like Calloway thrived on fear, on submission. But he also knew something else. Calloway had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because Jacob Henderson had a son, and his son was coming home. Thousands of miles away, Colonel Ethan Henderson was in the middle of a high-stakes operation when his secure phone vibrated. It was an emergency contact line, one that only a handful of people knew about. As he glanced at the screen, a familiar number flashed back at him. Home. Ethan had spent years leading elite Delta Force teams, executing classified missions in hostile territories, neutralizing threats most civilians would never even hear about. But this was different. A call from his father at such an hour sent an alarm through his system. He signaled to his second-in-command to take over and stepped away to answer. Dad. His voice was sharp, alert. There was a pause, followed by a sigh that carried the weight of exhaustion and quiet fury. Ethan, I need your help. His father's tone told him everything he needed to know. Something was very wrong. Talk to me, Ethan said, already calculating the fastest way to get back stateside. What happened? Jacob hesitated for only a second before recounting everything. The shakedown, the threats, the vandalism, and finally, his wrongful arrest at the hands of Officer Calloway. Ethan listened, his grip on the phone tightening with every word. By the time his father finished, a silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. You still there, son? Jacob asked. Ethan exhaled slowly, his mind already shifting into mission mode. I'm here, and I'm on my way. He ended the call and turned back toward his team, his expression unreadable. Captain Lisa Monroe, his second-in-command, raised an eyebrow as she approached. Something wrong? She asked. Personal matter, Ethan said, already moving toward the operations room. I need an immediate flight back to the U.S. Lisa frowned. You sure? We're in the middle of. I'm sure, he cut her off. I'll brief command on the way, but right now, I have to go home. Lisa knew better than to argue. Instead, she nodded. I'll make the arrangements. Within the hour, Ethan was airborne, his mind running through every possible scenario. He wasn't just coming home to visit. He was coming home to fix a problem. And when he fixed problems, he didn't leave loose ends. Jacob Henderson sat in his darkened home, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He had been released from jail hours ago, but he knew this was only the beginning. Calloway and his men weren't finished with him. They were waiting for him to break, to kneel. But Jacob had never knelt for anyone. As he stared at the broken remains of his shop from his kitchen window, he heard a familiar rumble outside. A vehicle pulled into his driveway, its headlights casting long shadows across the worn wooden fence. Then, the driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, Jacob recognized the silhouette immediately. Ethan. The younger Henderson moved with quiet precision, his posture radiating restrained tension. He was dressed casually, but the trained eye could see the calculated movements of a man who was always aware of his surroundings. Jacob opened the door before Ethan could knock. For a moment, father and son just stood there, neither speaking. Then Ethan stepped forward and embraced his father, brief but firm. When they pulled apart, his eyes scanned Jacob's face, noting the faint bruise on his cheek and the exhaustion in his eyes. "They put their hands on you?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Jacob exhaled through his nose. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Ethan's expression darkened. "That's not the point." Jacob placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know what you're thinking, but this isn't a battlefield." Ethan's jaw clenched. Then they shouldn't have started a war. By sunrise, Ethan had set up a makeshift command center in his father's house. His laptop screen displayed satellite images of Millbrook, flag points of interest marking known corrupt officers, political figures, and businesses involved in the town's illegal activities. He had called in a few favors, pulling files that shouldn't have been accessible to civilians. Within hours, he had a full breakdown of the police department's corruption network. The extortion racket was just the surface. There were deeper connections to organized crime, money laundering, and even ties to certain politicians at the state level. His father sat nearby, watching as Ethan's fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced ease. "How deep does this go?" Jacob asked. Ethan didn't look away from the screen. "Deeper than I expected." Jacob rubbed his temples. "So what now?" Ethan finally turned to face him. "Now, we put pressure where it hurts." That afternoon, Ethan made his first move. He started with the mayor, an influential figure with a hand in almost every corrupt deal in Millbrook. Using information he had gathered, he leaked a few key financial documents to an investigative journalist, hinting at the mayor's involvement in laundering money through fraudulent community projects. By the evening news, the mayor was already denying the allegations, but the damage was done. People were talking. Whispers of an internal investigation had begun circulating, and the first cracks had appeared in the once impenetrable wall of corruption. Next was Calloway. Ethan wasn't going to confront him just yet. That would come later. Instead, he started a slow burn, feeding anonymous tips to federal agencies about his shady dealings. Reports of suspicious bank transfers, evidence tampering, and abuse of power suddenly found their way into the right hands. And then, the final play, hitting the police department where they least expected it. Late that night, Calloway sat in his office, smugly sipping whiskey, thinking he had won. But then his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're not the hunter. You're the prey." Across town, his fellow officers were receiving the same message. And overhead, barely visible against the dark sky, a military-grade drone circled Millbrook, its silent, watchful presence a reminder. The ghost had come home. Jacob watched from his porch as Ethan leaned against his vehicle, arms crossed, watching the police station from a distance. What happens next? Ethan's expression was unreadable. "We wait." Jacob exhaled. "For what?" Ethan's eyes never left the station. "For them to realize their world is about to collapse." Ethan Henderson had always believed that the best way to dismantle a corrupt system wasn't through brute force, it was through exposure. He had seen it time and time again in war zones, where tyrants held power not through their own strength, but through the fear and silence of those they oppressed. Millbrook was no different. The corruption in the town had thrived in darkness, but now it was about to be dragged into the light. Ethan's first move was to find an ally, and he found one in Rachel Morgan, a journalist who had spent years trying to expose the corruption in Millbrook, only to be shut down at every turn. She had written countless stories about police brutality, illegal deals, and political fraud, but without solid evidence, her work had been dismissed as speculation. When Ethan reached out to her anonymously, she was skeptical. But then he sent her a file, one that contained more than just speculation. It was filled with bank statements, surveillance footage, and incriminating emails. It was the kind of evidence that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, Rachel received an unmarked envelope at her office. Inside was a flash drive containing footage of Officer Calloway and his men vandalizing Jacob Henderson's shop. It showed them laughing, spray-painting threats, and destroying the tools Jacob had spent decades collecting. Even more damning, the footage included audio Calloway openly discussing how they planned to frame Jacob for a fabricated crime if he didn't comply. Rachel wasted no time. She uploaded the footage to her news site and social media accounts. Within hours, the video had gone viral, spreading across the country. People were outraged, demanding accountability. Calls flooded the police station, demanding Calloway's resignation and an independent investigation. The local government, which had long turned a blind eye to the corruption, suddenly found itself under a spotlight it couldn't avoid. While the public outcry grew, Ethan worked behind the scenes. He had already infiltrated the police department's digital records, carefully extracting key evidence. He compiled a detailed report outlining the full extent of the corruption, illegal arrests, fabricated charges, extortion, money laundering, and even ties to organized crime. But exposing corruption was only half the battle. The real challenge was making sure those responsible faced consequences. Ethan had to ensure that this didn't become another case where the guilty walked away free due to bureaucratic loopholes. To do that, he needed leverage. One of the names that kept appearing in his research was Mayor Leonard Whitaker. A career politician, Whitaker had spent years carefully cultivating his image as a man of the people. But behind the scenes, he was the one pulling the strings. His campaign had been funded by dirty money, and he had personally ensured that Calloway and his officers remained untouchable. Ethan decided it was time for the mayor to make a choice: cooperate or go down with the rest of them. Late one evening, Mayor Whitaker returned to his office to find a file sitting on his desk. There was no note, no explanation, just a thick folder filled with damning evidence. Photos of secret meetings, financial records linking him to known criminals, transcripts of conversations he thought had been erased. Then his phone rang. "Who is this?" Whitaker demanded. "The man who just gave you a second chance," Ethan replied. "But only if you take it." The mayor swallowed hard. "What do you want?" "Simple. You're going to hold a press conference tomorrow. You're going to announce an independent investigation into the police department and city officials. And then you're going to resign." Whitaker laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I'm just going to throw away my career?" "You don't have a career anymore," Ethan said coldly. "You have a choice: cooperate and salvage what little dignity you have left, or refuse and watch your entire life crumble. Because trust me, if I have to release this evidence myself, you won't just lose your job. You'll be in a cell next to Calloway." There was silence on the line. Then, finally, the mayor sighed. "Fine. You win." The next morning, the town was in shock as Mayor Whitaker stood before the press, looking more defeated than ever. He announced the immediate resignation of several high-ranking officials, an independent investigation, and, as expected, his own resignation. But Ethan wasn't done. The FBI had been monitoring the situation ever since the footage of Calloway's actions had gone viral. Now, with the mayor's confession and the overwhelming evidence Ethan had compiled, they had everything they needed to move in. By nightfall, the FBI had raided the Millbrook Police Department. Officers were arrested on charges ranging from extortion to conspiracy. Calloway himself was dragged out in handcuffs, his smug confidence replaced with a look of pure terror. The man who had once ruled Millbrook with intimidation was now powerless. The takedown wasn't just about justice. It was a message. Corruption only thrived when people were too afraid to fight back. Millbrook had been afraid for too long. But not anymore. Jacob Henderson stood outside his shop, watching as the police department was emptied out, one arrest at a time. His son stood beside him, arms crossed, watching silently. "You did this," Jacob said finally. Ethan shook his head. "No, you did. You stood up first. I just gave the world a reason to listen." Jacob smiled slightly. "And what happens now?" Ethan exhaled. "Now we rebuild." But deep down, he knew this was far from over. Corruption didn't just disappear overnight. There were still people in power who would try to reclaim their control. There were still shadows hiding enemies who had yet to be exposed. And as long as they existed, Ethan would be there, waiting in those same shadows, ready to strike again when the time came. Millbrook had been a town ruled by fear and corruption for years. But now, after Ethan Henderson's intervention, the system that had thrived on intimidation and deceit was finally beginning to collapse. The once untouchable figures of authority, the mayor, the police chief, and their network of enforcers, were now facing the justice they had long denied others. The moment the FBI stormed the police department, arresting officers by the dozen, the foundation of Millbrook's corrupt leadership crumbled. The town, which had lived in quiet submission, was now alive with whispers of hope. For the first time in decades, people were daring to believe that real change was possible. With the mayor's resignation and the chief of police behind bars, the power structure in Millbrook was left in disarray. Officers who had not been directly involved in the corruption found themselves scrambling to maintain order while distancing themselves from their fallen superiors. The town council, previously a puppet of the corrupt administration, faced demands from citizens to clean up their act or step down themselves. One of the biggest questions was who would take over leadership in the police department. With nearly half the force implicated in illegal activities, the department needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. That responsibility fell to Ryan Parker, the one officer who had risked everything to expose the truth. Parker had worked under Calloway, forced to turn a blind eye to years of corruption. But when Ethan had given him the opportunity to stand on the right side of history, he had seized it without hesitation. Now, as the town's interim police chief, he faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. The fall of Millbrook's corrupt system wasn't just about arrests and resignations. It was about the people reclaiming their town. Local business owners, many of whom had been victims of the extortion racket, formed an alliance to support one another and ensure that no one would ever have to live in fear again. They created a community watch program, not to take the law into their own hands, but to ensure transparency in local governance and law enforcement. At town hall meetings, citizens spoke up like never before. They demanded new leadership, not just in the police department, but in every branch of government. Elections were held early, and for the first time in decades, the people of Millbrook felt like their voices mattered. Meanwhile, Rachel Morgan, the journalist who had been instrumental in exposing the corruption, was offered a national platform to tell Millbrook's story. Instead of leaving for a bigger news outlet, she chose to stay, determined to ensure that the momentum for change didn't fade once the headlines moved on. While the town celebrated the victory, Ethan knew that the war wasn't completely over. The arrests had sent shockwaves through the criminal networks that had fed off Millbrook's corruption, and some of the more powerful figures behind the scenes wouldn't go down without a fight. One name stood out among the files Ethan had obtained: Marcus Kane, a wealthy businessman with deep ties to organized crime. Kane had been the silent benefactor behind the police department's illegal operations, funneling money into the system in exchange for protection. With Calloway and the mayor gone, Kane was vulnerable, but he still had resources. He wouldn't sit back and let his empire collapse. Ethan knew that Kane's next move would be to silence those who had exposed the corruption. That meant his father, Rachel, Parker, and even himself. One evening, as Jacob was closing up his auto shop, Ethan sat across the street in an unmarked vehicle, watching. He had intercepted communications suggesting that Kane had sent men to deal with loose ends. And sure enough, as night fell, a black SUV pulled up near the shop. 3 men stepped out, their movements efficient, practiced. These weren't just hired thugs, they were professionals. Ethan wasted no time. Before they could even reach the shop's entrance, he moved in. Years of training kicked in as he neutralized the first attacker with swift precision. The second barely had time to react before he, too, was subdued. The third hesitated, realizing he was outmatched. He turned to run, but Ethan caught him, pinning him to the pavement. "You work for Kane?" Ethan growled. The man didn't respond, but the flicker of recognition in his eyes told Ethan everything he needed to know. "Tell him it's over," Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Tell him if he ever comes near this town again, he won't get a warning." The man nodded, scrambling to his feet and disappearing into the night. The next morning, Marcus Kane fled the state. Within a week, federal agents had frozen his assets and issued a warrant for his arrest. With Kane gone, any lingering threat to Millbrook disappeared. The town was finally free. Ryan Parker, now officially sworn in as chief of police, implemented sweeping reforms to ensure that history wouldn't repeat itself. Body cameras became mandatory, independent audits were put in place, and a civilian oversight board was established to keep law enforcement accountable. Rachel Morgan continued her work, turning her investigative skills toward ensuring that justice was served beyond Millbrook. The fall of corruption in their small town had inspired other communities to question their own local governments. What had started as one man's refusal to be intimidated had sparked a movement far beyond their borders. Jacob Henderson returned to what he did best: fixing cars and serving his community. His shop, once a target of corruption, now stood as a symbol of resistance and resilience. People came from all over just to shake his hand and thank him for his courage. As for Ethan, his job was done. The town no longer needed a ghost watching from the shadows. But before he left, he made one final promise to his father. "If they ever come back, if anyone ever tries to take this town from you again," Ethan said, "you call me." Jacob nodded. "I don't doubt that for a second." With that, Ethan drove off, disappearing into the horizon. There were other battles to fight, other towns like Millbrook that needed someone to stand up for them. Because as long as corruption existed, so did Ethan Henderson. And he was always watching. Millbrook was no longer a town ruled by fear. It was a town reborn, built on the courage of those who refused to be silenced. The fight for justice was never truly over, but for the first time in a long time, the people of Millbrook knew they had won. And that was enough. Lessons learned. The story of Millbrook is not just about a fight against corruption. It is a testament to the power of courage and unity. It teaches us that no one wins if they don't stand up. The corrupt only maintain control when good people remain silent. Truth is the most powerful weapon. When the truth is revealed, it has the power to dismantle even the darkest forces. The strength of a community is greater than any single individual. When people come together, they can change an entire system. Justice doesn't just come from the law. It comes from people willing to defend what is right. The story of Jacob Henderson and Ethan Henderson is not just about a personal battle, but an inspiration for anyone who has ever felt powerless against injustice. Change begins with small but decisive actions. Meaningful message. This story carries a powerful message. Justice doesn't happen on its own. It requires people who are willing to stand up, to confront, and to fight for what is right. In a society where corruption can infiltrate every corner, we need more people like Jacob, those who refuse to bow down, and Ethan, those who are willing to fight for justice. No matter who you are or where you are, remember that change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from taking action. Each of us can be part of that change. Call to action. If this story has inspired you, help us spread this message. Follow and subscribe to Story Precious to never miss powerful stories about justice, courage, and inspiration. Turn on notifications to be the first to receive our latest videos. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about this story? Do you believe justice can win everywhere? Let's discuss. Thank you for watching, and always remember, justice doesn't come from fear, it comes from courage.